Kinder, bet, morgen kommt der Swede, morgen kommt der Ochsenstern, wird den Kindern's beten lernen. Pray, little child, pray, because tomorrow the Ochsenstern will come and he will teach you how to pray. So this is my son coming home singing on a lullaby, basically. Of course, referring to, Nathan, what you already spoke about, the 30-year war and the fear of the Swede at the time that was so incredible and Sweden so ominous that it actually translates into a song that a child sings on 400 years later. Of course, obviously completely oblivious what it was about. But fear, I would say, today is no longer Sweden's image problem in Germany. It's really the profile issue is more a lack of profile. And the reason is that Sweden has not owned its profile or its narrative on the international scene effectively. For example, in the reporting around the UN or Davos, WEF, it doesn't really figure. And this comes at two false cost, of course. First, the strength of Sweden and what it stands for don't translate. Nobody knows about it. Across Germany goes largely unnoticed, for example, science, entrepreneurship, etc. And the second is that this narrative vacuum, so to speak, is filled with journalists using Sweden for their own agenda setting, perpetuating this idea of Bullebill, Astrid Lindgren's idyll, using Sweden as a projection, really, as a surface of projection and warping the image. I will give a little bit of a historical context of this and will establish that the bias of mostly left-leaning media has really largely kept this idea of Bullebill alive, even as negative news are increasing. And will conclude that Sweden's lack of ownership of its storytelling really carries risk, especially in times of need. And those times of need have come because the trend is now negative, clearly, and with very direct negative consequences as well. But just looking at shared Swedish-German roots, so Sweden and Germany have already been close. We've heard a little bit about it. Actually, going back to 500 BC, you can see it here, shared roots, and you can, of course, also hear it in the language, right? 100, 100, 100, 100, und so weiter. It's very audible still. Germany has historically been Sweden's most important trading partner, dating back to the Hande, and in the time of Gustav Vasa, of course, in Reformation, important economic, political, cultural impulses were imported by Germans. And of course, a significant part of Sweden's population spoke Germany. Throughout time, really, German was also the first language taught in Sweden's school until, incidentally, the end of World War II, when priorities shifted very subtly to English, but those generations all spoke German. Starting with Ludwig the German in 1843, Sweden has had many kings and queens, of course, from the continent, East Franconia, German, Roman, Habsburg empires, Christoph of Bavaria, of course, the famous King Carl Gustav the 10th, the 11th, famous Karl XII, were from the Wittelsbach family that ruled Bavaria, and Pfalz-Zweibrücken. And countless kings, of course, have married Germans. To this day, the mother of the current king was German, his wife as well. And military ties were, of course, also always close. And in fact, there was exchange with generals and military from Sweden training the Prussian army, for example. And the term Alter Schwede, Old Swede in Germany, is still a term of respect. These old ties and affinity, of course, also, and cultural exchange. Augustin Beck went to Berlin. He found his second wife there. Hjalmar Bergman drank himself to death there. I mean, there was a lot of exchange. These ties, of course, permeated in World War II. As you know, many in Sweden were on the German side in World War I, especially in military circles. And in World War II, Swedish neutrality really meant, in the words of Winston Churchill, that Sweden ignored the greater moral issues and played both sides for profit. Of course, the war was great business, and the German war effort relied on Swedish iron ore, and communist Russia was widely considered the bigger threat. And of course, there was also the personal ties of Hermann Göring living in Sweden between the wars and marrying a Swede that Hitler is said to have been very fond of as well. But very importantly is from this context is just that Sweden sort of after the war remained one of the few friendly neighbors, if not the only that Germany had. So there was still, it was a natural haven for people from war-stricken Germany, and contemporaries marveled at the wealth, the idea of Folkhemmet, where everybody would be cared for according to need, and of course the ideal of the equality between the sexes, and education and healthcare system were sort of seen as the path to socialist utopia in Germany. And as socialist countries failed, and you could see East Germany failing and communism really losing its appeal in line with the atrocities committed in its name, Sweden served as sort of proof that the concept was alive and doing well and was really viable. The ensuing media bias really persists to this day in Germany, and is probably the main reason why the idea of Bulle Bill might have become fractured, but is far from shattered. So the image of Sweden in Germany is still positive, but on a very sort of low level, because the knowledge about Sweden is very limited. According to the Swedish Institute, the level of knowledge about Sweden is relatively low anywhere apart from in the neighboring Nordic countries. And the German Media Tenor Institute analyzed that news coverage about Sweden in opinion-leading German media and international TV news between sort of in the last 15 years. And they say Sweden is simply below the awareness threshold in German TV news, for example. Their analysis is that reporting about current affairs in Sweden is just seen as sort of little public use in Germany, except when it comes to international sporting events, which is by far the category that's most reported on with regards to Sweden, and of course, the Nobel Prize. Now, what German journalists do consider valuable is to report selectively on Sweden for the purpose of their own agenda setting. In Sweden, as well as in Germany, media representatives are often left-leaning. There's surveys on this, of course, that about half either sympathize with Green, Socialist, or Left Party. And for example, the Green Party is largely overrepresented. 27% they said they voted Green, whilst in the general public, the Greens only get about 15%. And I think only 10% or 12% identified with conservative or liberal parties. So news from Sweden seem to be filtered and selected to support left causes. For example, when it comes to the labor market, it's not about general trends, but a disproportionate focus on gender issues. The situation of women is the main area of interest, and the reporting is overwhelmingly positive, as is the case on the employment of minorities. Sweden is also often referenced as an example of the positive effects of high taxation, and of course the welfare state overall is regularly praised. And there's also focus on the general asylum policy, which is portrayed in positive tone, and Sweden as a place of longing. The topic of immigration actually is interesting because as you can see here, German media is much more positive on Sweden than media in the UK or US. And one reason, I think, is that immigration is viewed more critically in UK and US. So a lot of this negative news is on immigration, whereas in Germany, when there's talk about immigration in Sweden, that's usually presented in a positive tone and as sort of the ideal of free immigration and integration actually working. Now, again, these trends have changed in the past few years, but overall, that's been the case. Nowhere, though, is the use of Sweden for domestic agenda setting more obvious than in the reporting on Greta Thunberg. She's by far the most referenced Swedish protagonist. She was featured 8 times more than Magdalena Andersson, as you can see, or Anders Tegnell or the King. And overwhelmingly positive, neutral to positive. This was also the time when Greta became sort of the face for the Fridays for Future movement in Germany, which in turn really helped the dynamic of the Green Party that, of course, went on to success, historic success actually for them in the election. So it's interesting because Sweden, when you ask the public, Sweden is not seen as visionary on sustainability or on environmental issues. It's really completely reduced to Greta. The media bias in the reporting is exacerbated by the one in Sweden, of course. Foreign correspondents source their stories in local media, so they unwittingly import the same blind spots and the self-censorship of the Swedish media. So while Sweden is used for agenda setting, it really fails to strategically and actively raise and shape its profile internationally. The UN framework, for example, is a framework where it's pretty easy for small countries to appear and become visible in the debate. But as you can see here, there's plenty of other, small countries that play a role, but Sweden doesn't really. There's also when you see the global business context with the World Economic Forum, for example, also a great stage where Sweden could play a role and be strategic in its communication. But there is no reflection whatsoever, for example, on Sweden outperforming other EU countries as an innovation leader or one of the most innovative economies in the world, the very vibrant startup scene. The news on Swedish companies is still in Germany centered around H&M, IKEA, very much old economy. So Sweden seems to behave a little bit like a family business in the past when it comes to communication. So any day without bad news is kind of a good day. And instead of being proactive, very content with a little visibility, which of course works well in good times, but it really costly to not having sort of paid into your reputation account and having established your strength and your relevance in times of need. And of course, detrimental is also that some negative news from Sweden have become too obvious to ignore. The tale of the a successful open heart policy on immigration has crumbled. Crime statistics and bombings in Sweden don't get much coverage in Germany. I'm always surprised how little, but they do get reported. And also things like Sweden having cheated so extensively on the PISA studies. The Germans have taken these PISA studies very, very seriously, and they've always looked at Sweden and said, it's amazing how well they're doing, and look at them, they don't give their kids grade, and everybody's included, and they're doing tremendously well. And this was hailed in all the socialist-led federal states, which incidentally also doing terrible in school. But of course, then it turned out Sweden had eliminated the lowest 15% of schools from this test, and that also eliminated the lowest in the worst schools that they accepted in the study, which were, of course, okay, so they're not the lowest. They also took out the students in the schools that would feel frustrated or depressed by participating in the test, which were the worst performing students. I'm not joking, this is actually what happened. So anyway, this was also a report. So it's sort of catching up that maybe not everything is going as well and the picture is not as picture perfect. And with negative news increasing, the positive image of Sweden in Germany is in decline. And financial analysts are even more negative. While journalists report on the country's outlook is relatively neutral, analysts are much more pessimistic than on Sweden and are much more pessimistic on Sweden and rate Sweden worse than Norway, Finland, or the Netherlands. But have these news really shattered the idea or the German idea of Bullerby? I would say not yet, because there's just a lack of interest, because Sweden is less relevant to Germany than many other closer or bigger European neighbors. And there's, of course, also a reluctance to draw the uncomfortable conclusions that come with such news, because Bullerby as a concept still holds enormous appeal, and it's tough to let go of utopia, and there's really no reason why the Germans should be any better at it. But the trend is clearly negative as recent news start to puncture an ideal that was fraught and unrealistic to begin with. And Sweden really needs to begin owning its story, driving a more realistic narrative in order to provide proof of its relevance as a player in Europe. Without such strategic communication, the cost can really be tremendous. And I think we've seen it recently. There's little to no public solidarity in Europe in times of need. Or did you hear any outcry at Turkey blocking Sweden joining NATO? Because in Germany, I didn't hear it. Thank you very much.